The Black Scholar Interviews Walter Rodney. Black Scholar. Walter, after you left the University of the West Indies, you went straight into research in African history. Why did you choose to go into that field? Rodney, you will remember that when we went to University of the West Indies in the early 60s, it was a time when there was a sufficient national sentiment for there to be a serious interest in Caribbean history. We were exposed to Caribbean history as a distinct break with a pattern in which previously there had been a preoccupation with European history. We then proceeded to explore much more deeply European and American history, so there was always a hidden dimension, that is the African background to Caribbean history. It is impossible to study the trade in slaves and to study synchronisms without becoming interested, if not excited by the possibilities of studying Africa. So I would say it was mainly that type of curiosity, to deepen my own and our collective understanding of Caribbean history in the first place, which pushed me in the direction of looking at West Africa. Black Scholar, you went to Tanzania? Why Tanzania then? Rodney, partly accidental. There was a time, again, we must locate it specifically with respect to the years in which these took place. In 1966, when I went out to Tanzania, it was shortly after the group in Ghana. This broke the period of several years in which Ghana held the focus as far as black people in America was concerned. It meant, for instance, that for those of us for a long time who had said we should go back to the continent, we should involve ourselves in one way or another, the fall of Nkrumah and the change in Ghana created a vacuum. And again, given the somewhat simplistic way in which we tended to think, we immediately sought out another model, another point of attraction on the continent, and quite clearly, Nyerere and Tanzania offered these points of attraction. So it was not a decision that was very surprising. I went to Tanzania roughly during the same years that a number of black people were beginning to show a great interest in that part of Africa. Black Scholar, to some extent, you have anticipated the next question. Some black people in the New World tend to take a position that Africa should be the main focus of the struggle, especially in relation to what you just said. Would you care to say something briefly about that? Rodney, I think I know to what you are referring, and in an exaggerated form, it clearly is false. There was a time when quite prominent spokesmen of the black cause, like Stokely Carmichael, for instance, seemed to have been saying that we need to abandon the struggle in this part of the world, the US and the Caribbean, because it was hopeless. We should seek Africa. We should engage in the liberation process of Africa, and that was the future of all black people. The impracticalities of that are so huge that they scarcely need emphasizing. Some of us can get to Africa. The vast majority of our people will, in fact, not be able to go there, and the struggle takes place where people live and work. That's the locus of struggle, and in that sense, it becomes self-defeating for someone in the Caribbean or in the United States to suggest that Africa is the sole or even the main vehicle of black struggle. Because black struggle must be universalized wherever black people happen to be. But there is a point in suggesting that the struggle of black people in Africa has a certain strategic importance, a greater strategic importance for black people as a whole than, say, what's going on in the Caribbean. I feel that to the extent that the African struggle advances and that the continent is freed from the coils of capitalism and imperialism, to that extent, the impact on the Caribbean and particularly the United States, the black population here is likely to be decisive. Yes, I would use a strong term as decisive because our history has been bedeviled by the fact that we, as a colonized people in the Western world, have never had a power to which we could turn, and that our oppressors have never felt any sense of having to account to somebody else for the treatment which they have accorded to us. I believe it is an important historical dimension, and therefore success of the struggle in Africa is likely to be critical with regard to creating new conditions and new avenues for the struggle in what we call the New World. Black scholar, you're leaving Africa and returning to the West Indies at an important historical conjunction. What are your views on the 6th Pan-Africanist Congress? What happened? Who went to it? And so on. Rodney, I will talk about two facets which concern us directly. First, the exclusion of the Caribbean delegations with the exception of official government delegations, and second, the overall significance of the conference. Throughout the Caribbean region, the groups who first addressed themselves to mobilizing people to attend the Pan-African Congress were precisely those groups who were not admitted into the Congress. The way in which this decision was taken is still unclear. There is a lot of sunshine. Sorry, sunshine is crazy because it was surmise. There's a lot of surmise, and there were just deputations moving from the Caribbean to Tanzania, and cables and telegrams and so on being sent in various directions, and precisely when and how the decision was arrived at is still not clear. But what is certain is that the governments of Africa, including those of Tanzania and those members of the OAU, who formed part of the party committee after the last OAU meeting in Mogadishu, which preceded the 6th Pan-African Conference, responded to a request, apparently to a demand, though, again, one is not certain, from given Caribbean governments spearheaded by the government of Guyana. The demands being that these groups should not be represented, groups which the Caribbean people know are as GRIA in Guyana, the New Jewel movement in Grenada, and various groups like MJAC in Trinidad, which sprung out of the 71 situation in Trinidad. These groups were excluded at the request or demand of the government of Guyana, possibly the government of Jamaica, one is not certain. Clearly to them, it was a disillusioning experience, but perhaps a necessary disillusionment, because throughout the New World we have shared a large number of romantic visions about the African continent. We have allowed illusions to take place of the serious analysis of what actual struggles are taking place in the African continent, what social forces are represented in the government, and what is the actual shape of society. We have the same mistake about Kwame Nkrumah, and we are very surprised when he was overthrown, because we thought that everything was fine in Ghana and that the CPP and Nkrumah had things perfectly under control. And we woke up subsequent to this overthrow to a realization that there was a class struggle developing in Ghana, and it was a natural consequence of that struggle that this particular stratum emerging as a petty bourgeois class around the Ghanaian state should act against an option which seemed to threaten them, with or without the direct intervention of imperialism. That the African states, however progressive, are at the present time far more likely to strike up an alliance with the Caribbean states as such is an object lesson here. It indicates that the class which governs Africa is prepared to ally with the class which governs the Caribbean. From there, we may inquire further to recognize that the same class is operating in both societies, irrespective of the fact that in some African countries, that class may be behaving in a more responsive manner to the interests of the mass of peasants and proletariat. These are hard. When I tell you, people from the 1960s are assholes, let me tell you that. People from the 60s are assholes. Baby boomers are assholes. Or that there may be structures in some of those countries which reflect a high degree of organization and consensus of the masses, or consciousness of the masses. But still, it is the same class that we are dealing with, and people in the Caribbean, so-called radicals and progressives in the Caribbean, have had to learn that hard lesson, that we are dealing with the state power, and that we must examine the class nature of that power. We have seen a rather humbling situation in which people who have worked with the West Indian masses, who sometimes opposed the governments of the Caribbean, have found themselves excluded from a conference at which somebody like Gary was a star. so that he could come back and say, I have read the statement to the effect that governments of Africa will not condone, tolerate, or establish links with people in the Caribbean who are against the governments in the Caribbean, and, regretfully, his statement is probably correct. That is the most important lesson for us Caribbean people, that we cannot romanticize the situation in Africa. We must draw distinctions. Who is in Africa, or who is who in Africa? What are the state structures? What are the classes? We must begin to conceptualize the problems of Pan-Africanism as problems of forging links with social groups. The problem is to develop solidarity between the Caribbean peoples and the African peoples. It is not the same question as developing solidarity between African states and the Caribbean states. Admittedly, one cannot be so naive as to imagine that one could ignore a state and move directly towards establishing relationships with its own population. We will have to be more selective in ensuring that our relations are nurtured with particular progressive governments, with particular liberation movements, and particular social organizations, whether they be trade unions, women's movements, students' unions, various groups that develop a perspective on the African struggle. One must see as the goal of our international identity itself conditioned by the fact that the struggle is taking place in these various African territories, is to develop a perspective that is anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and that speaks to the exploitation and oppression of all people. Without that vision, we would continue to be naive, and we would continue to be disillusioned in the way in which I think people were disillusioned by their non-participation in the 6th Pan-Africanist Congress. Those are the lessons for us. But of course, the Congress was not thereby a failure, because a number of participants from the Caribbean were excluded. Because, although what I would loosely call the progressive faction was a minority faction, I would say that it prevailed in many respects. Several governments of Africa took a very strong stand that was anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist. The governments of Guinea, of Tanzania itself, Somalia, of Congo, Brazzaville, Algeria, and they were joined by the government of Cuba. In addition, there were the liberation movements, particularly Frelimo, and the political committee was chaired by Guinea, aided by Marcelos dos Santos from Frelimo. They were in a minority, but they were prevailed. The kinds of documents which came out reflected their formulation of the question that the black predicament today must be resolved within the context of a socialist revolution, as distinct from suggesting it was merely a liberation from Europe, which left us free to elaborate a capitalist form of society. I say documents, and this is where we must be very careful to understand that the Congress could not have done much else than prepare documents in any event, because a number of people seem to have imagined that the Congress would go out and do something immediately that would transform the world's black situation. Guys, men making information is so difficult to interpret. That's why I literally I hate male on men scholars. You guys are so... Anyway, sorry, let me just breathe. That, to my mind, is an incorrect reading of the Congress's potential and function. Some people felt that the Congress had the possibility of institutionalizing itself and establishing institutions of a Pan-African nature which would address themselves to technology, for instance, a big proposal to the Congress. Apparently, some people were actually thinking along the military lines, so I was told. I was not at sessions. And some of our brothers do have this fascination with militarism, so they were thinking in terms of Pan-African High Command, and this goes away beyond any reasonable expectation of what Congress could do and could not do. In order to make the point very clearly, one would need to go back and reassess the earlier Congress. The Congress in the 1920s, for instance, had a very modest objective. They sought to influence the world powers to ameliorate the conditions of black people. It was as modest as that. When Du Bois spoke to Blaise Diagne in France, 1920, Blaise Diagne, then being a deputy from Senegal, Du Bois asked him if it would be possible to have a congress in Paris. Blaise Diagne replied saying he would check with the Clemenceau, the French prime minister, and when he did check, he said, "You can have a Pan-African conference. Clemenceau says it's all right." So that, in fact, it was imperialism that was giving us permission to hold a Pan-African Congress. Under those circumstances, the gains could be limited. They could have only reflected some attempt to influence the liberal section of the imperialist world, unless, by chance, one could play off some of the contradictions between the imperialists themselves, such as the contradictions between the British and the French and the Germans at the end of World War I. Then, and subsequently, right up until 1945, or just before 1945, the objective of most Pan-African congresses was not to establish any institutions, but simply to prevail upon the colonizing powers to be more responsible, more humane, more interested, and to allow black people land, liberty, and a certain amount of freedom and self-development. In 1945, things changed in a certain manner. They changed because the black spokesperson in 1945 suggested that it was time we addressed ourselves to our own people. In effect, what they were saying at Manchester was, if we as black people in different parts of the African continent are to organize politically, we have the power and the capacity to overthrow colonization. That was precisely what happened, and it was an important development. It was a change of emphasis. Instead of focusing upon the colonialists, we were looking towards our own people. Now, 1945, therefore, pushed the Pan-African movement towards looking at the activities of African peoples and, in a sense, they were quite correct that the mobilized African people were capable of achieving political, or at least constitutional, independence. In 1970, the idea of the Sixth Pan-African Congress was first voiced because a new situation had come into being. African states were indeed independent. Caribbean states were independent. The Second World War had come and gone, and the post-war situation had involved tremendous changes, including changes in the international division of labor, changes which meant Africa was involved in a new pattern of colonialism, which we call neocolonialism. If the Congress was to be meaningful, then I think that its major task was to define our attitudes and our positions relative to the new changes in the world scene, relative to the existence of independent African governments, relative to the continued armed struggle against colonialism in parts of Africa, relative to the condition of black people in the Caribbean and in the Americas today. In this sense, the Congress really did its job. I think the resolutions did address themselves to the vision of the future, if you like. The progressive states and delegates were saying that if we are to resolve the crisis of Africa, if we are to liberate the African people, or if the African people are to liberate themselves, then this liberation must take into account that our enslavement and our colonization were within the orbit of the capitalist system. We have existed within the framework of imperialism and liberation means more than just a national struggle. It means a deepening of social struggle and the bringing about of a social revolution. This they put on the agenda, which was very important because a large number of Africans and black people in this country and in the Caribbean still refuse to put the question of socialism high on the agenda. That's all one could ask from a group of black people who are looking at our predicament, that they should recognize the essentials of predicament, and they should chart the major lines, not the details of the paths of emancipation. C.L.R. James used to say that in 1945, when they were talking about African independence, only lunatics and invalids were talking about African independence. That was in 1945, and it is true, because when you read the reports of the colonialists, they imagined they were in Africa for good. A few of the more liberal ones said perhaps in 100 years we will have trained these Africans to be independent. So in 1945, to talk about independence was a revolutionary thinking. It was to pose to the African people the vision of the future, the possibilities inherent in their own action. I think today to talk about socialism and anti-imperialism is precisely to pose the African people the path out of the kinds of constraints that capitalism has brought about in the African continent, in the Caribbean, and in America itself. And therefore, perhaps it doesn't do us too much harm if some of us are referred to as lunatics and inspirates in this present era. Black scholar, Walter, the official reality in the Caribbean is no different from a majority of neo-colonial countries, and yet in Jamaica, Trinidad, Grenada, Dominica, and a number of places, there have now been signs that the Caribbean struggle is moving away from the more restricted constitutional kinds of independence. We can't turn you into another kind of Caribbean expert overnight, but what would you think would be the general requirements for the progressive development of the struggle in the Caribbean now? Rodney. The fact is that I have been out of the region for a considerable period of time. While I have attempted to keep abreast of the things by reading, by the kinds of letters I get, by excerpts from newspapers, and so on, I would not like to suggest that I can feel the pulse of West Indian society, because it is very obvious that a lot of things are taking place. Things unknown of, unthought of, at the time when I was in the Caribbean. When we were in secondary school, our consciousness was nowhere near the consciousness of young Caribbean people today. They have resolved that the system under which they live is so intolerable that they are prepared to put their lives on the line, and this is a development which I never personally witnessed in the Caribbean. This is something I am just reading about. So I say that not to avoid the question but to give, I think, a reasonable reservation about my own capacity to answer the question about where do Caribbean people go from here. Having said that, I would perhaps answer with reference to the overall third world situation as I see it. I feel that the peoples of the third world are now at the heart of the human condition. Questions which are not posed in the metropolitan centers in this country and in Britain, or at least not widely posed, do not receive any serious answers, are really raised in the third world. People raise these questions on the street. People raise these questions by implication when they ask some other simpler questions about their ways of life. In other words, they are not asking simply for change, for reform, for marginal modification, or their lives, but they are actually saying that they do not understand how, and they do not believe that they can continue to live in the old way. And that has a real material base. The peoples in our parts of the world are finding it almost impossible to survive, literally. The problem is that at the level of food, clothing, and getting shelter. It is those very fundamental questions which our peoples answered in some sort of haphazard manner for a long period of time. There was a struggle to get some land and to see if one could make do on the land that is land, and that is clearly played out. There was a struggle to run away to other parts of the world, as our very presence here in the US attests. The Caribbean is the world's most famous out-migration region. I mean, it is the place that black people run away from all the time, ever since slavery. So that there were some devices by which people managed to keep a perspective that there were some possibilities of survival and advance within the region, either on a permanent basis or until such time as they could escape. I feel that in the Caribbean, as well as in other parts of the third world, the crisis of capitalism and of imperialism within the last few years have been manifest to such a degree that it threatens even the question of the existence on a sort of breadfruit level, if you like. It is as clear as these people are bad at not bad, but it's just hard to read what these people are saying. That's why I do this. It is as clear to me, just from the data of things like unemployment statistics as a very important index of social well-being or social misery, that our people are not just failing to advance, but regressing because the proportion of the population that is permanently unemployed continues to grow. The Caribbean governments today do not disclose unemployment statistics. It's classified material. It's treasonable to indicate how many people are unemployed, understandably so. Years ago, when the Jamaicans stopped giving unemployment figures, it was at 25%. And that was when I was an undergraduate. I shudder to think what it is now. For the first time in my own experience in Jamaica, perhaps there were people in Guyana, I met people of, let's say, 25 years of age, sometimes older than that, who have never had a job. Not that they were temporarily unemployed, but they had never had a job. That is the phenomenon rooted in the Caribbean. In our societies, traditionally unemployment meant that cane season is not in for sugarcane. Some person is temporarily unemployed, or somebody was working as a stevedore, but he hasn't been picked today, or that he hasn't got a job in the last few weeks. But the idea of a society incapable from the beginning of ever giving an opportunity to a significant proportion of its population to earn a livelihood is a really frightening idea. That should be also, for us in South Africa, that should be also thought of. That reality is a reality which is threatening the whole of the third world, and I believe that it is for that reason that our people have to move. It is a question of move on and survive, or accept the situation and be starved to death. And I believe this will guide the movement of society in the Caribbean for the next few years, especially since we are obviously in the throe of a depression. It has already hit the third world. What is called a recession here in the US has actually reached the proportions of a depression, which means that there is less productivity. There will be less jobs. There is an actual fall in the gross domestic product and the per capita income in certain parts of the third world. We are not even feeding our population. We blame it on famine. We blame it on world shortages. But ultimately, it comes back to the social system in which we live, because the Chinese are not starving, and they have many, many more mouths to feed than we have in a little country called Guyana, or in some other little place called Trinidad, or in an even large country such as Tanzania. This may seem a roundabout way of answering your question, but I'm suggesting that there are objective conditions compelling the peoples of the Caribbean forward, and once we look at those objective conditions, and they do not change, then we must presume that our people's consciousness will continue to march in accordance with those objective conditions. Black scholar, reading one of your writings, you said that it was a pity that the Caribbean intellectuals had not paid more attention to the significance of the Cuban Revolution in the context of the Caribbean region itself. Could you expand a little bit on this very important question? Rodney, in recent times, the trend to ignore Cuba has changed, and the change itself is significant. The change is a measure of the success of the Cuban Revolution. The North Americans sought to isolate Cuba. They sought to crush it by isolation. They failed to do so. They pushed the other Latin American territories and the other Caribbean territories into a position where they were virtually banned from having relations with Cuba. These territories, partly because of international contradictions and partly because of the stability and the success of Cuba, have now, in the main, moved towards either establishing links with Cuba or expressing an interest in establishing links with Cuba. From what we can tell, even the United States government is willing to do so that there is today more respect for the Cuban position. A number of people who called themselves progressive in the Caribbean for many years adopted a position of suspicion or even hostility towards Cuba, based supposedly on an analysis which said that Cuba had not emancipated itself. It had merely changed masters from the United States to the Soviet Union, which was a very superficial analysis. The tremendous transformation in Cuban society must, it seemed to me, be a model in the sense of our being able to utilize some insights which the Cubans gaining from their mistakes as well as their achievements. What clearly cannot be overlooked is that the pre-revolutionary Cuban society was not fundamentally different from, say, Jamaican society. That, to the extent it was different, it had gone further along the road of integration into international capitalism, especially new forms like tourism. So how on earth do we really imagine that if the massive tourism of pre-revolutionary Cuba had done nothing but create misery, when we follow along that path, we could succeed? If we have been unable to solve the problems of unemployment within the old social structure, that is, within our present capitalist structure, and the Cubans have done so, they have done so to the extent that Cuba is so badly in need of labor. They have expanded social production in all spheres that they are terribly short of labor, while we are experiencing the problem, which I mentioned earlier, or a tremendous growth in unemployment rates. When those objective factors are brought into being, it seems that any reasonable person, any honest person in the rest of the Caribbean should try to understand what has been going on in Cuba. Even though today there is a certain fascination with elements of the Cuban development and some unwillingness on the part even of the West Indians, petty bourgeois themselves, to try and pick from Cuba, it is not a fundamental story of the Cuban Revolution in a Caribbean context with an attempt to understand what was the framework of the Cuban Revolution. There is a tendency, it seems to me, on the part of the more advanced and sophisticated of our petty bourgeois rulers to do what clever bourgeois politicians always do, that is to take an eclectic position and say, well, we will borrow from here and borrow from there anything that seems to be a useful gimmick in terms of survival, in terms of buying time, can be utilized. But social policies cannot simply be borrowed at random. It was a whole system, a whole new way of organizing life that has been developed in Cuba. And this has not yet been given serious study in the British or French-speaking Caribbean. Black scholar. Walter, we understand that you have been away from the Caribbean for a long time and not in touch with the reality as somebody who has been living there. Nonetheless, we would like you to speak to a judgment that has been made of the left in the Caribbean, that it is too segmented in a number of small and weak groups, that in any territory there isn't a revolutionary party which has support in all sections of the working class and the peasantry. To what would you attribute this? Segmentation of black forces at the beginning of a struggle is practically inevitable. It's a reflection of the dominance of the ruling class at the level of organization, because the state is the most powerful organization. It is precisely through the state that the bourgeoisie in the capitalist society manifest themselves as a class. They are individual capitalists. They compete with each other. How is it that they operate as a class and are more conscious of themselves as a class than the members of the working class and the members of the peasantry? It is largely because of the state. It is in and through the state that they manifest their true class interest, when those class interests are posed in antagonistic manner against the interests of workers and peasants. So when working class people and peasants began to organize against rather monolithic state, their efforts inevitably appear fragmented and appear to be petty, appear to be divisive. The positive aspects of political life, of course, are defined as strategies required for collecting the various grievances that, at a particular point in time, represent the interests of the mass of the exploited and oppressed. In other words, to define the major contradiction and to unite forces around those contradictions. If we are to look at the Vietnamese Revolution, we would see that their triumph was a triumph of bringing together the several elements which had clear interests against French colonialism initially, and later on American imperialism. They did not start as a unified movement. Discovery creates unity. Similarly, in Guyana-Bissau or Mozambique, unity is created in struggle, and is so much more valid because it is created in struggle. So initially, to see division and to see a number of petty groups proliferating is not necessarily a negative feature. What, of course, one has to be on guard against is an entrenchment of this type of politics. But I don't feel that is likely to occur where there is a mass movement pressing upon these groups. Segmented politics, factional politics, persist when there is no mass base, because they are not attached to any vibrant working class movement. So they must fall back to discuss tendencies among each other, and then when one tendency is established, it fragments. And when 5 people have a movement, it soon breaks into sections comprising 3, which is a majority, and 2 who are called the minority, and so on. Black scholar. Walter, this is the final question, and perhaps the most important for those people who are going to read this. You have been both a political activist and an intellectual worker. What kind of worldview have you formed to integrate and advance the struggle? Probably, I should try to answer that somewhat obliquely. Obliquely. Obliquely?
Obliquely.
Okay, obliquely.
Obliquely.
Obliquely. Doing something in an indirect, roundabout way, or moving and positioning something at a slant rather than straight. Okay, so obliquely. He wants to answer the question obliquely. And make a statement that implies to a number of the other answers that I have given, which is that I am not necessarily the best person to evaluate experiences in which I have been involved. Indeed, it sometimes can be argued that the individual involved in the process is less capable of distinguishing between appearance and reality than somebody else. Certainly, when it comes to the question of what is your own ideological perspective, people do not always, and I don't think I can be much different in this regard, very consciously at the beginning of their own development, see exactly where they're at. So that what I say today in 1974, maybe rationalizing the position that I may have been at in 1960 or 1965, or at some other point in time. I think that this limitation should be made clear. Beyond that, I would suggest that I feel that I was guided by a feeling that one had to have a certain commitment to a given social group. I could see that our society was differentiated in particular ways, and I could see that people in their daily work, and particularly people like myself involved in teaching, involved in academic and intellectual activities, were giving their loyalties to some faction group. And I would like to think that to the extent that I could manage it, I did in the past, and I do at the present attempt to make what I say and what I do a part of a commitment to working people. The peoples who are either directly at the point of production or whose labor in some way or another is exploited, and who, therefore, are victims of the system of exploitation that is called capitalism. That is one dimension. Moving beyond that, though, connected with it is the philosophical world view itself. Over time, I have come to realize that, like all of my contemporaries, and like scholars who have come out of the womb of the bourgeois society, I have had certain bourgeois values. I saw the world in a way that capitalists intended that I see the world, or at any rate, my attempt to see the world for myself and on behalf of other peoples was severely restricted by frames of references which I had acquired precisely in the process of supposedly advancing along the educational ladder and moving towards a more skilled position, so that the struggle was to disentangle this commitment on my part from the ideological framework with which I started, and to try and develop an alternative vision of the world, which was more in tune with that emotional or gut commitment to representing our own people. And once it got into this seriously, it was quite obvious that there are only two worldviews with which we are faced. One must deal with the metaphysics or the idealist formulation of the bourgeoisie, or one must move towards scientific socialism. I would not come forward with the bold statement that I am a scientific socialist, not because of any of my shyness to be associated with it, but because I feel that it is a goal rather than anything else, something towards which one strives. To be scientific in looking at our society is fraught with many dangers, limitations, and perils. One would much rather have somebody else say that a given piece of analysis was indeed scientific, rather than for me to self-proclaim and say that I am a scientific socialist. Within the limits of all that, within the limits of my own social formation and historical background, I, at the present time and in the recent past, have been consciously attempting to grapple with the reality around me by using a definite frame of reference which puts me at the center of the universe, the relationship between man and his material environment, which moves from that trying to understand what social relations develop in the process of production, which seeks to examine the various forms of alienation in our society, the central one being the alienation of labor, and all the other cultural and political features that stem out of that. And this is an attempt to develop a a consistent alternative to the bourgeoisie worldview on the grounds that if we claim to be to be opposing the capitalist system, but we do so on the ideological terms laid down by the bourgeoisie, who were and are rationalizing capitalism, we are either going to end up as reformists at best, or we are going to be frustrated, or we are going to mislead ourselves and other people to think that we are really entering into some new avenues when all we are doing was proving or providing some gloss on the old bourgeois logic and the old bourgeois mislogic in many cases. Okay, Black Scholar, thank you very much. There are some quotes that I wanted to just see if were nice to read. We have shared a large number of romantic visions about Africa and continent and allowed... Yeah, okay, never mind. Those are all from the same reading. So, yeah, those are just highlights. Anyway, thank you.